Hello, everyone. Our paper is Comparative Evaluation of Call Graph Generation by Profiling Tools, and I, Onur Jankur, and Abhinav Batale are the authors in this paper, and we are from the Department of Computer Science at the University of Maryland. So, analyzing the performance of parallel programs is critical to obtaining high efficiency in HPC architectures, but it's a challenging task due to the complexity. And there are many profiling tools that allow for measuring and analyzing performance data. However, they differ in their profiling methods and capabilities. In this paper, we compare to evaluate call graph data generation capabilities of several profiling tools. Specifically, we compare to evaluate Caliper, HPC Toolkit, Scorpy, and Tau using AMG, Lulesh, and Quicksilver proxy applications, considering their runtime overhead, memory usage, data size, data correctness, and data richness. As I mentioned, there are different methods for profiling, and one of the methods is instrumentation, and it can be done by instrumenting the source or binary code. Instrumentation basically collects performance measurements at each instrumentation point, and it can be done by the user or the tool itself. And the other method is sampling. It periodically samples the program, checks the program counter, and collects function call stack. It aggregates the performance measurements of a code block across multiple samples. So in this paper, Caliper and Tau support both sampling and instrumentation. HPC Toolkit supports only sampling. Scorpio supports instrumentation, and it supports sampling partially. And the reason we say that it's partial is because it samples the instrument execution. And the first comparison we make is comparison of runtime overhead. So the execution time of an application should not be perturbed significantly by the profiling tool. And so we measure the execution time of each application using MPI wall time function call. We measure the execution time with profiling and without profiling. And dividing these two values gives us the relative execution time. And the next comparison is comparison of memory consumption. Similarly, performance tools should not consume large amounts of memory. And to make this comparison, we obtain the largest memory usage at any point during program execution using getRUsage function call. So again, we measure memory consumption of each application with profiling and without profiling, and subtracting these two values gives us the additional memory usage. In addition to runtime overhead and memory consumption, we also investigated the information gathered by profiling tools. Specifically, in this paper, we considered calling context trees. And a calling context tree is a tree of call paths, and a call path is a sequence of function invocation. Calling context trees provide contextual information such as file, line number, function name, call path, load modules, process and thread IDs, and also some performance metrics such as time, flops, and cache misses. For the rest of the presentation, I will refer them as call graphs. So the next comparison is the comparison of size of call graph data. Profiling tools generate significant amount of call graph data, especially when we use multiple processes. And in this comparison, we use default settings and collect per process data. And we compare which tool generates more data, basically. However, generating more data might not be a downside. So if the tool that generates the largest amount of data also generates the most detailed data, then it's not a downside. So further analysis on the call graph data is needed. So after gathering the data, we also analyze their correctness and detail richness. So to do that, we need to do postmortem analysis, and we use and develop Hatchet tool to make this analysis. So Hatchet enables analyzing call graph data programmatically by providing a data structure called graph frame, which is a Python graph object and a pandas data frame. So, for example, we can identify the slowest node using the data frame, and then we can manipulate the graph and get the call path of the slowest node. And this is how we use Hatchet in this paper. So we also compared correctness of call graph data with the assumption that if the data generated by multiple tools is nearly identical, it should be close to the ground truth. Again, the default settings are used for each tool, and specifically, we first looked at the top 5 slowest call graph nodes to investigate if the tools identify the same slowest nodes. Because if one of the 4 profiling tools identify a different node as the slowest node, then that might be something that we investigate further. And then we also looked at the call path of the slowest nodes to see if the tools provide the correct program structure. And we also looked at file and line number to see if the tools provide correct information about the source code. And this is also important because after identifying the slowest node using the profiling tool, then we should be able to locate that part of the code in source code and optimize that part of the code. So file and line number information should be correct. And then we looked at hot nodes. And a hot node is the leaf node in a hot path in which all nodes account for 50% or more time of their parent. So it gives us actually the most time-consuming call path. And we also make this comparison. And the next comparison is the richness of call graph data. So here, richness of call graph profiling data refers to having detailed information in the call graph. Again, we use default settings for each tool. And specifically, we investigate maximum and average call path lengths, number of nodes, number of .so files, number of MPI functions, to investigate if the call graph data provides sufficient information or if it has some abnormalities. So here we emphasize that, for example, having a longer call path doesn't make a tool's data more tool's data richer or than the other profiling tools, because call path might be wrong, might contain unnecessary or repetitive information. So instead of that, we here in this analysis, we look at if the data provides sufficient information or if it has some abnormalities. And experimental setup, we already talked about profiling tools, proxy applications, and evaluation metrics. We build each tool and proxy application using GCC 831, OpenMPI 301, and we performed our experiments on a parallel machine that has x86-64 architecture. All applications are written in C, C++, and use only MPI. We performed weak scaling experiments, and we evaluated sampling and instrumentation methods separately. So now we will see some of the interesting results, and we start with runtime overhead. So on the left, we see the results for Quicksilver when we use varying sampling intervals. And the sampling interval is the time spent between two samples. So if the sampling interval is 5 milliseconds, that means the tool samples the program every 5 milliseconds. So if the sampling interval is low, that means the tool samples the program very frequently. Here, in this figure, the x-axis is the sampling interval in milliseconds, and y-axis is relative time, execution, runtime overhead. So the first thing we see is that Scorpio causes more overhead than the others because it samples the instrumented executable, which also causes some overhead. But the other interesting result is that as we lower the sampling interval, caliper, Scorpio, and tau do not work consistently. And the next result is that shows the runtime overhead when we use default instrumentation methods. Again, we see the results for Quicksilver, and on the x-axis, this time we have number of processes instead of sampling interval. And here we see a similar pattern. Scorpio causes more overhead, and then tau, and then caliper. And this is related to their default instrumentation methods. And then the results for the memory consumption. On the left, we still see the results for Quicksilver using varying sampling intervals. But this time, on the y-axis, we have the additional memory usage in kilobytes. Here, we can say that the difference between tools, the difference in memory consumption is not significant, and they are close to each other. But we can see that tau consumes more memory than others, and Scorpio consumes the least amount of memory. And if we use default instrumentation methods, we see a similar pattern. Tau consumes more memory, and Scorpio consumes the least amount of memory. And then evaluation of generated data size. So this time we see the results for AMG. Again, when we use varying sampling intervals. So on the y-axis, this time we have data size in megabytes. So this is the call graph data generated by the tools. We can see that tau and HPC toolkit generates more data compared to Scorpio and caliper. And that's because they generate a separate file for each process, while Scorpio and caliper generates a more compact data. For example, caliper generates just a single JSON file that contains information about all the processes. And when we use default instrumentation methods, again, we see a similar pattern. Tau generates more data, and caliper generates the least amount of data. And the next one is the evaluation of call path correctness. So here we will see call path of the second slowest node obtained by different tools for Lulesh. And the reason that I'm showing the second slowest nodes is because tools usually agree on the slowest node, but they do not agree on the second slowest node. And this is more interesting. And here, the leaf nodes are the second slowest nodes, and we see their call paths for different tools. So if we look at A, HPC toolkit, and B, Scorpio sampling, they identify the same node as the second slowest node. But if we look at C, Scorpio instrumentation, and D, Tau instrumentation, they identify a different node as the second slowest node. So, the second slowest node that identified by profiling tools are different from each other, but they usually agree on the slowest node. And finally, we evaluate call path richness. So here you see the results for AMG for each tool and for each method, profiling method that they support. Here for sampling, we used fixed sampling interval, 20 milliseconds, and we use default instrumentation methods, and each execution used 64 MPI processes. So here I will only highlight some of the interesting results. For Scorpio and Tau generates very large call paths if you look at the max depth and average depth columns. And the reason is that there's a recursive function in AMG, and they do not aggregate the information about that recursive function, but instead they, every time that when the function is called, they add it to the call path. And then number of all and unique nodes, we see that Tau sampling generates more nodes, but HPC toolkit generates more unique nodes. And we realized that Tau's default output format contains some unnecessary and some information that is not very useful. And then when we look at the number of .so files, the load modules, all and unique, we see that all tools except Scorpio, when we use sampling methods, they generate information about .so files, but Scorpio is not able to generate .so files because it samples the instrumented executable, and instrumentation cannot provide information about .so files. And finally, if you look at the number of all and unique MPI functions, Tau generates more nodes related to MPI functions, and Caliper generates the least amount of nodes related to MPI functions, and the difference is quite big. So as a summary, this is the first empirical study on call graph data generation capabilities of profiling tools. This is a preliminary study to compare profiling tools. And we evaluated Caliper, HPC toolkit, Scorpio, and Tau, and we considered their runtime overhead, memory consumption, and the size and quality of the generated call graph data. And that's it. Thank you for listening.